Some warnings arrive too late to change anything, and some arrive exactly on time, which is its own kind of grief. Prince William had long ago made a private accommodation with the fact that his mother had not been given the chance to say everything. He had accepted, in the particular quiet way that people accept the things they cannot alter, that Diana's death had taken the remainder of her words along with everything else, and that he would spend his life in the gap between what she had managed to tell him and what she had been preparing to say. He had built something livable inside that gap. It had cost him considerably. He was wrong to think the gap was permanent. Inside a locked secondary compartment of a Windsor estate storage unit, a preservation container holding documents transferred from Kensington Palace's private correspondence archive following a 2019 facilities review, a palace official conducting a routine inventory had discovered a sealed envelope addressed in Diana's own handwriting. The letter inside, authenticated within hours by forensic comparison against verified samples from Diana's estate, had been written in the late summer of 1997. It had never been opened. It had never been delivered. And the warning it contained, addressed to William by name, had been waiting inside a mislabeled container for 26 years, while her eldest son grew into the man she had been afraid he might have to become alone. When William finished reading it in a restricted Windsor reading room, those present in what has since been described by people close to the household as an afternoon of profound stillness, he set the letter face down on the table, placed both hands over it as though anchoring it to the surface, and lowered his head. The room did not move around him, neither did he, for a long time. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The Windsor Estate Archive, the protected collection where the monarchy preserves its most sensitive historical correspondence and family records, occupied a set of climate-managed storage facilities that had undergone partial reorganization following infrastructure repairs to the palace complex. In what those familiar with the process have described as a secondary audit of transferred materials, an official cataloging legacy containers had encountered a discrepancy. A sealed envelope listed in a 1998 transfer log as general personal effects had been stored inside a compartment whose reference number belonged to a separate file category entirely. The discrepancy was the kind that accumulates silently in large institutional archives, a single misfiled reference that propagates forward through every subsequent catalog without anyone noticing because the error is consistent, not random. The envelope had been correctly described in the sense that its external details matched the log. It had been incorrectly filed in the sense that it was never where it was supposed to be. When the official opened the outer container and saw Diana's handwriting on the envelope beneath, she stopped the audit and contacted the palace records supervisor immediately. William had arrived at Windsor by mid-morning, before the authentication process was complete. He had been told only that something personal had been found, something that appeared to have been written by his mother and addressed to him. He had sat in the reading room with Catherine beside him and waited while the archivists completed their verification, in what those who were present have described as a silence so absolute that the authentication team worked more quietly than they normally would, as though sound itself felt intrusive. A sealed letter, in palace archival terms, refers to personal correspondence that has been formally closed by its author with the intention that it be opened only by its named recipient. The authentication confirmed the seal was original, unbroken, untampered, consistent with materials used by Diana's household during the period in question. William had asked one question when the lead archivist delivered that confirmation. Had anyone else read it? No, he was told. No one had opened it, not in 1997, not in any of the 26 years since. He had nodded once and asked to be left alone with it. Catherine had stayed. She sat at the edge of the room while William opened the envelope carefully, without tearing the seal line entirely, as though some part of him wanted the opening to be reversible. She watched him read. She did not watch his face. She watched his hands, because she had learned over many years that his hands told her things his expression was trained not to. By the third page, in what those who understand their private dynamic have described as a telling detail, his hands had stopped moving entirely. William had been, from the earliest years that those around him could remember, a child who understood more than he was meant to. Diana had spoken about this in documented accounts from people who knew her during the years when the marriage was deteriorating and the pressure inside Kensington Palace had become something that filled rooms before anyone walked into them. She had described her eldest son as someone who absorbed the emotional atmosphere of the people around him, with a sensitivity that she found both moving and worrying. Moving because it meant he was always reaching toward the people he loved, and worrying because it meant he was always carrying what they were carrying, in addition to everything that was already his. She had tried, in the way that mothers try things they cannot fully accomplish, to protect him from the weight of being too perceptive, in a family where perception was both a survival skill and a form of suffering. What she had not managed to protect him from was the specific damage of watching two people who loved him become unable to occupy the same room, and of understanding, at an age when he should not have had to understand anything of the kind, that his loyalty was being measured by both of them simultaneously, and that either expression of it would be read as a betrayal by the other. Charles received news of the letter's existence through a brief documented communication from his private secretary, the senior official responsible for managing confidential information passing through the royal household, and he had, in what those close to him have understood of his manner in such moments, asked two questions in sequence. The first was whether the letter was genuine. The second was whether William had already read it. When he was told that William was reading it now, Charles had set down what he was holding and said nothing for a moment that those present described as notably long. Catherine, watching William from across the reading room, noticed the exact moment the letter's tone shifted. It was not a change in his posture or an audible sound. It was the stillness, the particular quality of someone who has just encountered a sentence they are going to have to read more than once before they can decide what to do with it. She crossed the room quietly and stood beside him without touching his shoulder. William, without looking up, moved the pages slightly so she could read alongside him. She read 3 lines. Then she sat down. The letter did not open with grief, or with the particular tenderness that Diana's public expressions of love for her sons had always carried. It opened with a warning, and the warning was addressed not to the child William had been, but to the man she had feared he was going to need to be. To understand why Diana had written the letter, and why it had never arrived, it was necessary to return to the summer of 1997, to a private meeting at Kensington Palace on an evening in late July, when Diana had come to a decision that those who knew her during that period have described, in the reconstruction that has gradually emerged, as characteristic of the particular clarity she found when she believed time was shorter than other people thought it was. She had asked her personal solicitor to remain after a scheduled estate planning session. The solicitor, a private legal advisor, is a professional who manages confidential personal and financial matters on behalf of a client, and is bound by strict obligations of professional discretion. The formal part of the meeting had concluded. Diana had been sitting with the summary documents still spread across the low table in front of her, not looking at them, looking past them in the way she sometimes did when she was thinking about something the documents did not cover. She had told the solicitor she wanted to write something for William, not for the estate record. Those documents were already in order. Something personal, something that would reach him when he was old enough to know what to do with it, and that would say what she had not yet found the right moment to say directly, partly because there had always been another occasion approaching, and partly because the thing she wanted to say was the kind of thing that was easier to write than to speak. The solicitor had prepared paper. Diana had declined. She had written the letter herself, by hand, over the course of approximately 2 hours, with the solicitor present at the other end of the room. She had not asked for the solicitor's input. She had not read it aloud. When she finished, she had folded it, sealed it, written William's name across the front, and asked the solicitor to ensure it was stored with her personal family correspondence. Not the estate documents, not the official archive, but the private collection that was to be held separately until her sons were old enough to receive it. The solicitor had followed that instruction precisely. He had delivered the letter, along with several other personal family items, to a Kensington Palace household administrator responsible for managing Diana's private correspondence. What happened next was not malice. It was not conspiracy. It was the particular kind of institutional failure that occurs when a careful person follows a reasonable process that turns out to have been built on an incorrect assumption. The administrator who received the letter had classified it, in keeping with standard practice for personal family correspondence held by the palace, within a category that was then transferred, during the reorganization of Diana's estate materials in 1998, to Windsor. The transfer reference had transposed 2 digits from the original code. The envelope had arrived in Windsor correctly labeled against the wrong location number, had been filed in the storage slot matching its new incorrect reference, and had remained there, perfectly preserved and entirely invisible, for the next 26 years. No one had hidden it deliberately. No one had read it and decided William should not have it. It had been lost by a 12-digit filing error made in a period of enormous institutional pressure, by an administrator who was doing their job carefully and had simply, on this one occasion, made a mistake that no one had the occasion to catch. This would have been, in some ways, easier to bear than what William found when he examined the storage records. The custody log, the formal document tracking every movement, classification, and access event associated with an archived item, was delivered to the reading room alongside the letter. William went through it methodically, in what those familiar with his approach to difficult information have described as characteristic of the focus he brings to things he cannot afford to misread. The transfer error appeared clearly in the 1998 entries. The incorrect reference number, the wrong storage location, the administrator's initials beside the classification, all of it consistent with a genuine administrative mistake made under significant pressure during a period when Diana's household materials were being consolidated under circumstances that no one in the palace had been trained to manage. What appeared in the 2009 entries was different. In 2009, a senior archival official, a records administrator responsible for conducting periodic reviews of legacy storage materials, had examined the Windsor estate containers as part of a decade-end audit. The audit's purpose was to identify any items that had been misfiled, mislabeled, or stored under incorrect reference numbers during the turbulent reorganization period of the late 1990s. It was precisely the kind of review designed to catch exactly the kind of error that had swallowed Diana's letter. The official's notes from the 2009 audit appeared in the custody log. They showed that the container holding Diana's envelope had been opened, examined, and reviewed. The official had noted the presence of the sealed envelope. He had noted Diana's handwriting on the exterior. He had noted the name written across the front. His classification decision, recorded in his own hand beside those observations, read, "Retain in current location. General personal effects. No active recipient designation on file." William read that entry. He set the log down. He read it again. The official had seen the envelope. He had seen Diana's handwriting. He had seen William's name, and he had filed a note observing that there was no active recipient designation, meaning no entry in the official estate records linking the envelope to a named person who was supposed to receive it, and had left it where it was. A recipient designation was a formal notation in the estate management system indicating that a specific item was to be delivered to a specific person at a specific time or condition. Without that notation, The envelope had appeared to the reviewing official as an unsealed personal effect, with no clear disposition instruction, rather than as a letter meant for William that had arrived in the wrong place with its paperwork separated from it. The solicitor who had carried out Diana's original instruction had died in 2004. The administrator who had made the transfer error had retired in 2001. The chain of people who had known what the envelope was and where it was supposed to go had broken before anyone thought to check whether the envelope had arrived. William pressed one finger against the 2009 entry and held it there. He was 36 years old in 2009. He had been an adult for nearly 2 decades. The letter had been reviewed by an official who had seen his name on it, and had left it in a container where it would not be found for another 15 years, because the paperwork linking the envelope to its intended recipient was stored in a different file that no one had thought to cross-reference. The official who had conducted the 2009 review was still alive. William asked for his contact information before the afternoon was over. Catherine noticed the shift in her husband's posture between the moment he finished reading the custody log and the moment he looked up. What she has described to those close to her as the change from grief into something colder. She asked him, quietly, what he intended to do. William said he intended to understand exactly how far the chain of failures ran before he decided anything else. The room where William met King Charles that evening was not a formal space. In what those familiar with the arrangement have described, William had specifically asked to use a small private sitting room, rather than any of the Windsor spaces that carried ceremonial associations, a room without history, he had apparently said, which those who knew him understood as meaning a room that would not press its own significance onto what he needed to say. Charles was already inside when William arrived. He had not brought an advisor or a private secretary. William had not brought anything except the custody log, folded to the 2009 page, and the letter itself, which he carried in its original envelope. He placed both on the low table between them without ceremony, and he sat down, and for a moment neither man spoke. Charles looked at Diana's handwriting on the envelope without touching it, in what those who have come to understand the texture of that evening have described as the look of a man encountering something he had not known existed, and is rapidly assembling what its existence means. William asked his father one question. Had he known that Diana had left a letter for him? Not whether he had known its contents, not whether he had arranged for it to be hidden, but simply, had he known that his mother had written something for him before she died that was supposed to reach him? Charles answered, in the reconstruction of those who have come to understand the substance of that conversation, that he had not known the letter existed. He had known that Diana had spoken, toward the end, about wanting to write things down for the boys, that she had mentioned it in the context of estate planning conversations he had been peripherally aware of. But he had not known she had done it. He had not known there was a letter. William said that he believed him. He said it without warmth, as a statement of assessment rather than a statement of comfort. He then asked a second question. The 2009 audit had been conducted during a period when Charles had been regularly reviewing the management of Diana's legacy materials as part of his responsibilities toward the estate. Had Charles ever been informed that a personal item bearing William's name had been found in the Windsor archive and left in place without being delivered? Charles said he had not been informed of that. William opened the custody log to the 2009 entry and turned it to face his father. Charles read it. He read it again. He set it down and removed his reading glasses and held them in both hands for a moment before he looked up. He said that the official's decision was inexplicable to him, that seeing a personal letter addressed to his son and filing a note about absent paperwork rather than making a phone call was not a decision he could account for or defend. William said he was not asking him to defend it. He was asking him to understand that Diana had sat down in the last weeks of her life and written something meant for her son, and had taken careful steps to ensure it reached him, and that 26 years later it had been found in a storage unit by an inventory official doing a routine audit, because a 12-digit filing error and one inexplicable decision in 2009 had kept it away from him for the entirety of his adult life. Charles said he understood. William said that understanding was a beginning. He said it in a tone that those who have come to know him would recognize as the particular controlled register he uses when he is saying the most serious thing he intends to say. He told his father that he wanted an independent review of every piece of Diana's personal correspondence currently held in palace storage. Not the estate records, not the official archive, but the personal materials. Every item, every custody log, every classification decision. He wanted to know whether the 2009 failure was isolated or whether it was one instance of a pattern. Charles agreed immediately. He asked William what else he needed. William said he needed to call his brother. Harry had not known about the letter. He had not known that Diana had written one, had not known it existed, and had not known it had been found until William called him. The call lasted, in what those close to both men have described, considerably longer than most of their recent conversations. Harry's initial response, by the account of those who understand how he processes information of this kind, was not anger at William. It was the particular quality of silence that arrives when something confirms a fear so old you had almost convinced yourself it was irrational. The fear that there were things Diana had tried to leave for both of them that the institution had failed to ensure they received. He had carried that fear without naming it, because naming it would have required him to believe that the palace was capable of a level of institutional failure he had preferred not to examine too closely. The letter, he said, proved the fear was not irrational. It had been a reasonable response to a real situation. William said that was one way to read it. He said there was another way, which was that the failure had been genuine rather than deliberate, and that the distinction mattered. Harry said the distinction mattered less than the result, which was that their mother had written them something from the last weeks of her life, and neither of them had received it until one of them was nearly 50 years old. William did not argue with that. He asked Harry if he would come and read it with him. Harry arrived the following morning. There had been, in what those familiar with the arrangements have described, some discussion about logistics and about whether advisors should be present. Harry had said no. William had said no. They had agreed on a room, on a time, and on the condition that whatever happened inside it would not be briefed, summarized, or released in any form without both of them making that decision together. The room was the same one William had used the evening before. Harry sat across from him with no folder and no prepared position, and William set Diana's letter on the table between them. Not open, not yet, the envelope still carrying the seal line where William had opened it carefully the previous afternoon. Harry looked at their mother's handwriting on the outside of the envelope for a long time before he looked up. William said, "She wrote it in July 1997. She sealed it herself. She asked the solicitor to make sure it reached us." Harry said, "Us, or you." William said, "She addressed it to me, but she wrote about both of us. You'll see." Harry nodded once. He said, "Then read it to me. The way she would have wanted it to arrive. Out loud, from the beginning." William opened the letter to the first page and read it aloud in a private room with no one else present, for the first time, to the only other person in the world who had an equal claim to what it contained. Diana's letter did not carry the soft register of someone saying goodbye. It carried the register of someone who had something specific and urgent to communicate and was determined to communicate it clearly, because she was afraid that if she softened it, the sharpness of what she needed them to understand might not survive the reading. She had written about the institution. not with the bitterness that had characterized some of her public statements during the worst years, but with the particular precise concern of someone who had lived inside a system long enough to understand exactly which parts of it were likely to damage the people she loved most. She had written that she feared the Crown would do to William what it had tried to do to her, not through malice, but through the gradual replacement of his private self with his public function, until he could no longer locate the difference between what he genuinely felt and what he had learned to perform. She had written that she had watched this process begin in him while he was still a child, and that she had tried to slow it without knowing how, and that she was afraid she had not managed to slow it enough. Her warning was not political. It was not institutional criticism in the formal sense. It was a mother's account of watching her son learn, at an age when he should have been learning other things, that emotion was a liability, and composure was a form of protection. She had written that she wanted him to know, from her directly, that the composure had never fooled her, that she had always known what was underneath it, that she had loved what was underneath it, the unguarded version of her son that appeared only when he was certain no one important was watching, far more than she had loved the polished performance the palace had been training since he was old enough to stand in public. She had also written about Harry. She had written that she was afraid the institution would do something different to Harry, not the replacement of private self with public function, but the ejection of private self from the public frame entirely, until Harry came to believe that the only way to be himself was to exist in opposition to everything the Crown represented. She had written that she did not want either of her sons to spend their lives defined by their relationship to an institution, rather than by their relationship to each other. And she had written that she knew, by the time she was sealing this letter, that the most likely threat to that relationship was not anything either of them would choose, but the slow accumulation of decisions made around them by people who believed they were helping. Her last warning was simple. She had written it in the final paragraph, in the handwriting that became slightly larger and more deliberate when she was making certain something would not be misread. The Crown will always need something from you. It will always have a reason. What I am asking you to make sure of, William, what I am asking you to keep track of, in the moments when duty and love seem like the same thing, is that you know which one you are actually choosing. Harry, by what those present outside the room have described from the quality of the silence that followed, did not speak immediately when William finished reading. When he did speak, he said, "She knew." William said, "She always knew." Harry said, "We spent so long thinking she didn't see it." William said, "She saw everything. She just couldn't stop it. So she wrote it down instead." They sat with the letter between them for a long time after that, in a room that had no portraits on the walls and no ceremonial associations, and no history of its own to press upon the moment. By the account of those who came to understand what had passed between them that day, they did not reach a resolution about anything that had divided them in recent years. They did not make promises they could not guarantee. They did not perform reconciliation for an audience that was not present. What they did was read their mother's letter together, in a room no one else was in, and allow it to mean what she had intended it to mean, which was that she had seen them clearly, and loved what she saw, and had been afraid for them in ways that had turned out to be entirely justified, and had written it all down, so that even if she ran out of time, the knowledge that she knew would find them eventually. It had found them, 26 years late, in a Windsor reading room on an afternoon that no one had scheduled for this purpose. Late was not the same as never. Diana had understood that too. By the following morning, the fact of the letter's existence had moved beyond the private rooms where it had been read. In what those monitoring communications in and around the royal household have described as an unusually rapid progression from discovery to public knowledge, the broad outlines of the story had reached several journalists simultaneously before any palace statement had been drafted. Outside Kensington Palace, By mid-morning, a crowd had gathered at the gates. Not an organized gathering, the spontaneous kind, the kind that arrives when people feel something has happened that concerns them personally, even though it occurred behind closed doors. They brought flowers, as people always do at that gate. They brought handwritten cards. One woman arrived carrying a single white envelope, blank and unsealed, and stood at the front of the crowd holding it at her side without explanation. A photographer found her within minutes. The image was on 3 front pages before the palace statement was released. A national broadcaster that evening framed the discovery not as a royal scandal, but as something the public found harder to categorize. Proof that an institution capable of preserving centuries of state documents had failed, for 26 years, to deliver a sealed letter from a dead mother to her living son. The broadcaster left the obvious question in the air: what the failure revealed about the gap between what the palace claimed to preserve and what it actually managed to protect. She wrote it, he never knew. The headline ran above a photograph of Diana in the summer before her death, looking directly at the camera with the expression that had always seemed, to those who studied it, like someone who understood exactly what was being missed. 2 people standing outside the palace gates argued in front of a camera about whether the failure had been deliberate or negligent, and whether the distinction mattered, and whether William would ever be given back what had been taken from him, even accidentally. Their disagreement reflected, in miniature, the larger national conversation that had begun the moment the story broke. Charles released a personal statement through the palace press office that afternoon. It confirmed the letter's discovery and authentication. It confirmed that William had received it and read it. It confirmed that the contents would remain entirely private. It announced an immediate independent review of archival classification practices for all personal family correspondence held across royal estate facilities, to be conducted by an external body with no connection to the household. It acknowledged, in language that those familiar with palace communications recognized as unusually direct, that what had happened represented a failure of institutional care for a private family matter, and that such a failure was unacceptable, regardless of whether its cause was negligence, error, or the absence of adequate oversight. The official who had conducted the 2009 audit and left the letter in place was retired and had not spoken publicly. An independent investigator had been asked to take his account as part of the archival review. The palace statement did not name him and did not characterize his decision. It said only that all decisions that had contributed to the delay would be examined. Institutional reform was announced in the same statement. A mandatory cross-referencing protocol for all personal correspondence items held in estate storage, requiring any item bearing a named recipient to be actively traced against a living contact before being retained in a general archive category. The reform was formal. Its meaning was simple. What had happened to Diana's letter could not happen again. William watched the coverage privately with Catherine. He did not release a personal statement. Catherine had advised, in what those close to them have described as characteristic of her counsel, in moments when public response risked overtaking private meaning, that the letter belonged to him and to Harry, and that every word he offered the public about it would be used to discuss something other than what Diana had actually intended. He had agreed. Harry did not speak publicly either. His silence, which those who had expected another open conflict with the palace had interpreted as unusual, was in fact the direct result of a conversation between the 2 brothers in which they had agreed, without lengthy negotiation, that their mother had written privately and sealed the letter herself, and that the only appropriate response was to receive it the same way. William returned to the Windsor reading room alone on the evening after the statement was released. He had asked for the letter to be kept there, in a protective case, until he and Harry had decided together where it should be permanently stored. He sat with it for a while without opening it. He had read it enough times by then that he did not need to. and thought about what Diana had understood about him that he had spent decades convincing himself no one had noticed. He thought about what it cost, the performance of being fine. The way it had become, over many years, so practiced that the performance and the reality had become difficult to separate even from the inside. He thought about what it meant that his mother had seen the separation clearly from the outside and had written it down in the last weeks of her life as the thing she most needed him to know she had seen. Catherine came in after a while and sat beside him without asking whether he wanted company. She had learned, over many years, that the question was unnecessary when the answer was evident. He told her that what he kept returning to was not the warning itself, or even the love underneath it, but the act. Diana, sitting down in a room in Kensington Palace in late July 1997, with everything she was carrying, and choosing to spend 2 hours writing something careful and true and honest for a son who would not read it for 26 years, trusting that it would reach him, trusting that the effort of saying the thing precisely was worth making, regardless of when it arrived. Catherine said, "It reached you." William said, "Very late." Catherine said, "She knew it might be. She wrote it anyway." He looked at the letter in its protective case and understood that this was perhaps what his mother had most needed him to understand. Not the warning, which he had spent his adult life working out on his own, but the proof that she had tried to reach him even from a position of uncertainty, with no guarantee the letter would arrive in time to matter. It had arrived too late to change anything that had already happened. It had arrived in time to change how he understood the person who had written it. Harry called that evening from several time zones away. He asked William how he was. William said that was a question he intended to spend some time answering properly, which Harry understood to mean that he was processing something larger than the conversation could hold, and had chosen honesty over performance, which was itself a change. They agreed that the letter would be stored in a jointly controlled family archive, a protected collection requiring both their formal authorizations before any access, examination, or transfer could take place. Neither the palace nor either of them individually would hold it alone. Diana had written it for both of them. It would belong to both of them. That was the only arrangement either brother found acceptable, and they had reached it without difficulty. Charles apologized to William privately, through a conversation that those close to the family have described as extending well beyond what either man had initially intended. He accepted that the archival failure had occurred on his watch, that the 2009 review had been conducted by someone operating within a household culture he had shaped, and that the outcome, a letter sitting in a mislabeled container while William grew up without it, was a consequence he could not deflect responsibility for simply because the error had been administrative rather than intentional. William did not offer the forgiveness Charles had not asked for. He offered something the monarch had not expected, which was a specific and concrete request that Charles speak publicly, at some point, about the difference between institutional protection and institutional control, and about what the palace had learned from 26 years of getting that distinction wrong. Charles said he would. What Diana's letter had restored was not the years that had passed without it. Those were not recoverable. It had not restored the closeness between William and Harry that the last decade had damaged, because a letter, even this letter, was not capable of doing that work alone. It had not removed the weight from William's shoulders that his mother had identified and named and feared for in those final quiet pages. What it had done was something harder to name and more durable than any of those things. It had proved that Diana had seen him clearly, had loved what she saw, and had been afraid for him in ways that were neither dramatic nor institutional, but deeply, specifically, maternal. The fear of a mother who understood that the child she loved most was learning, under enormous pressure and without adequate protection, to disappear himself for the sake of the people around him. She had written that down, she had sealed it, she had trusted it to survive. It had survived 26 years in a mislabeled container in a Windsor storage facility. It had survived a filing error and an audit and a classification note and the death of every person who had originally known it existed. It had arrived, finally, in the hands of the son it was written for, in a room with no ceremonial history, on an afternoon that had not been scheduled for anything of the kind. Diana had not been able to protect William from what she feared. She had not been able to slow the institution's claim on him, or keep his brother beside him, or ensure that the two of them would face what was coming from the same side of the same door. But she had written down what she had seen, and what she had feared, and what she had wanted him to know, in the belief that even if everything else failed, the act of saying it clearly, and sealing it, and sending it forward into whatever came next, was worth doing. William had received that act, 26 years late, with everything it contained. His mother had known him. She had been afraid for him. She had tried. That, in the end, was what the letter had come to deliver. Not the warning, though the warning was true, and not the love, though the love was also true, but the proof that the distance between them had never been what it appeared, and that Diana had understood her eldest son far more clearly than the silence between them had allowed him to believe. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next.